Shepherd's Bush, West London. A busy multicultural district where life spills out of cafes, markets, and terraced streets. Among those streets stood the modest home of Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso, two men who had built a quiet, happy life together over more than 30 years. Paul, at 71, was a retired civil servant, reserved, dependable, the kind of man neighbours described as steady and polite. Albert, 9 years younger, was the opposite in many ways. Lively, warm, with a natural charisma that drew people in. Together they were a balance, calm and fire, comfort and charm. Two friends, they were a couple who had weathered the years and built a love that felt unshakable. That love, and their instinct to welcome others, would be their undoing. In July 2024, their home became a place of unthinkable violence. They had invited into their lives Yostin Andres Mosquera, a 35-year-old Colombian national who presented himself as bold, glamorous, and adventurous. On the surface, he was a guest, even a companion. But beneath the smile and charm, Mosquera had already set his course. By the time he stepped through their door, prosecutors would later reveal, he had been searching online for chest freezes, for how bodies decompose, for the lives of serial killers. He had even looked into the value of the property in Shepherd's Bush. Every search suggested intent. Every click was a rehearsal for what was to come. For Paul and Albert, the evening of 8th of July 2024 began like so many before. A warm home, familiar company, a trusted guest. But behind those closed doors, a betrayal was already unfolding, one that would end in horror and leave an entire community in shock. Inside the Shepherd's Bush home, the three men moved about as guests and hosts do. Nothing from the outside suggested what was about to happen. But somewhere within that house, Yostin Mosquera made his decision. His first target was Paul Longworth. At some point that day, Mosquera reached for a hammer. The blows, investigators later determined, were deliberate and repeated. They came down with such force that Paul's skull shattered, bone fragments driven deep into his brain. The pathologist's report confirmed the violence of the assault. It was sustained, devastating, and impossible to survive. There were no signs of defensive wounds. Paul never had a chance to fight back. Once Paul lay still, Mosquera did not call for help. He did not stop. Instead, he dragged the body across the floor and forced it beneath the bed. The act was cold, calculated, a concealment, not a reaction. It left Albert, who was still alive in the house, unaware that his partner of 30 years was already dead, hidden just a few feet away. When forensic officers later searched the bedroom, they found Paul's remains tucked under the bed frame, blood soaked into the carpet fibres. Above, the room looked almost normal, as if a thin veil of domestic life still clung to the space. But underneath, in the shadows, was the brutal truth. The first killing set the rhythm of what was to follow. It was carried out in silence, without warning, and hidden away like a secret. For Albert, the partner he had lived alongside for decades, the horror was invisible, but the danger was already inside the house, and it was waiting for him next. If Paul's death was sudden and hidden, Albert's killing was the opposite. Prolonged, staged, and captured on film forever. Albert Alfonso had a taste for recording his private encounters. He had fitted cameras in his home, never knowing that they would one day document the final, agonizing minutes of his life. On the night of the 8th of July 2024, Albert and Mosquera were filmed together in what prosecutors later described as an extreme sex act. Albert was dressed in a white swimming cap and a black leather eye mask, the mask leaving him blind, vulnerable, unaware of the danger in the room. Then, without warning, the encounter turned. Mosquera picked up a knife. What followed was frenzied. He stabbed Albert over and over, the blade driving into his body again and again until his strength gave way. Pathologists later confirmed the injuries were multiple and fatal. The horror of that moment was not just in what could be seen, but in what could be heard. When the footage was first played in court, it was shown without sound. Even in silence, the violence was unbearable to watch. The next day, the jury heard the audio. As Albert's final moments unfolded, Mosquera's voice could be heard asking him, "Do you like it?" Seconds later, Albert's last breath echoed through the courtroom. It was, as one prosecutor described, a traumatic watch, so raw and disturbing that the room sat in total silence. For investigators, this evidence was beyond dispute. It showed not just murder, but murder committed with cruelty and awareness, a killing turned into a performance. The footage from the Shepherd's Bush house did not end with Albert's final breath. What it showed next horrified even the most experienced detectives. After killing both men, Yostin Mosquera stripped naked. His body was slick with blood, the floor around him stained with violence. And then, instead of fleeing or showing even a flicker of remorse, he began to dance and sing. The scene looked almost surreal. A man moving through the carnage he created, celebrating as though murder were a performance. Prosecutors later told the jury that this moment defined who Mosquera really was. Not a man who lost control, but one who relished in what he had done. But the grotesque celebration was only part of what came next. Mosquera began to dismember the bodies. Both Paul and Albert were decapitated. Their heads were placed into a chest freezer, while other body parts were methodically packed into suitcases. Detectives would later note the chilling calmness of these acts. There was no chaos, no rush. He was deliberate, controlled, almost meticulous in the way he prepared the remains for disposal. For the prosecution, this dismantled any suggestion of panic or self-defense. This was methodical, organized violence, the work of someone who had already decided what to do long before the first blow was struck. For investigators and jurors, the images of Mosquera dancing in blood, followed by the grim dismemberment, would become some of the most haunting evidence in this case. It was not only that two men had been murdered, it was the way their deaths had been mocked, their humanity stripped away, turned into a spectacle by the man they had once welcomed into their home. By the morning of July the 10th, 2024, 2 days after the killings, Mosquera had already begun the next phase of his plan: disposal. Inside the Shepherd's Bush house, the grim preparations were complete. The severed heads of Paul and Albert were sealed inside a chest freezer. Other body parts were packed into large, heavy suitcases. To Mosquera, these weren't human remains. They were evidence to be moved, hidden, discarded. His destination was Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, a Victorian landmark usually celebrated for its beauty, now about to be scarred by horror. Witnesses later recalled seeing Mosquera struggling with the luggage. The suitcases were so heavy that blood was reported to be seeping from them. One passerby, noticing his difficulty, joked, "What have you got in there? A body?" No one could have imagined how close that remark was to the truth. At some point, Mosquera abandoned the cases on the bridge. When police opened them, they discovered the dismembered remains of Paul and Albert, hacked apart, packed away, reduced to nothing more than baggage left in a public place. The discovery triggered immediate alarm. Within hours, Avon and Somerset police were working alongside the Metropolitan Police. A luggage label on one of the cases provided the first crucial lead. It traced directly back to the couple's Shepherd's Bush address. When detectives forced entry into the home, they uncovered what was left: the blood-soaked crime scene and the freezer containing both men's heads. In one chilling moment, Mosquera's private violence had spilled out into the public. What he thought he could conceal was now open, and the investigation into one of Britain's most shocking double murders had truly begun. The discovery of the suitcases on Clifton Suspension Bridge left police with no doubt. They were dealing with a double murder of extraordinary brutality. Now it was about finding out the man responsible. Meanwhile, CCTV footage and phone records placed him on trains in and around Bristol in the days following the killings. He was moving between cities, but the net was already tightening. On the 13th of July 2024, just 3 days after abandoning the suitcases, police arrested Mosquera at Bristol Temple Meads station.
I've got a hand, mate.
Go.
Yeah.
Right, you say the words then, I'll get secure. Go. Say that, John, yeah.
Oh my god. What happened? Oh shit.
Secure.
On your side, mate. What happened? Move your legs out to the front. Sit up.
At this time, mate, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything, but may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned, something you later rely in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence. Do you understand?
No. What?
You are currently under arrest for murder, okay?
What's your name, mate?
What?
What's your name? Nombre.
Jot.
Jot?
Yeah.
Dot or Joss?
Jot.
Surname? Jot what?
Jot. Mosquera.
Mosquera?
Yeah.
By then, the case against him was overwhelming. Forensic evidence, digital searches, stolen finances, CCTV, and, above all, the harrowing footage from inside the house. For detectives, the question of who had committed the murders was answered. What remained was for the courts to decide how to deal with a man who planned, killed, mutilated, and then celebrated his crimes. By the time Mosquera entered the dock, the evidence against him was vast, but nothing carried the weight of the video from inside the Shepherd's Bush home. The first trial, held in May 2025, collapsed over technical issues around evidence timing. For the families of Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso, it was another cruel delay. But in July 2025, the retrial at Woolwich Crown Court began, and this time, nothing would be left out. When the footage was played, the courtroom fell into an unnatural stillness. First, the jury saw it without sound. Even in silence, the images were unbearable. Albert, blindfolded with a black leather eye mask, wearing a white swimming cap, trusting, unaware, and then the knife. The next day the sound was added. That was when the horror deepened. As we mentioned, Mosquera stabbed Albert again and again. His voice could be heard asking, "Do you like it?" And then came the sound no one in court would ever forget. Albert's final breath, captured on video forever. Detectives who had seen decades of violent crime later admitted it was one of the most traumatic pieces of evidence they had ever encountered. DCI Ollie Stride described the investigation as one of the most harrowing in living memory. Mosquera's defense clung to claims of loss of control or even self-defense, painting the killings as the result of an extreme sexual encounter gone wrong. But the prosecution dismantled that argument piece by piece. The searches, the thefts, the methodical dismemberment, and above all, the grotesque dance of celebration. None of it spoke of panic. All of it spoke of planning. On the 21st of July 2025, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of both murders. Their decision was swift. Their rejection of the defense absolute. Mosquera was told he would face life imprisonment, with a minimum term to be set at sentencing in October 2025. For Paul and Albert's families, the verdict brought some relief, but no real peace. For the jurors, it marked the end of weeks spent watching and listening to evidence no one should ever have to endure. And for Britain, it was the conclusion of one of the most disturbing double murders in recent memory. But the story is not yet finished. Mosquera will be sentenced on October the 24th, 2025. A psychiatric report has been ordered, not to question his guilt, but to assess the mind of a man who planned, killed, mutilated, and then celebrated what he had done. For the detectives, the case left scars. They spoke of images they could not unsee: the blood-soaked dance, the knife, the sound of Albert's last breath. It was, as one officer described, an investigation that never leaves you. In the end, Mosquera's crimes created more than 2 victims. They left grief and trauma etched into families, jurors, investigators, and a community forced to face the reality of what had happened behind closed doors in Shepherd's Bush. The case of Yostin Mosquera is not just about the brutal deaths of Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso. It is about trust betrayed in the most unimaginable way. 2 men, together for decades, opened their door to someone they believed was a friend. In return, they were met with cruelty beyond comprehension. The brutality of their murders, filmed, mocked, and celebrated, shocked Britain. But beyond the gore and the headlines, there were simply 2 lives cut short, and families left to live with a grief that no verdict or sentence can erase. This story forces us to confront an unsettling truth: that evil does not always come in shadows. Sometimes it walks through the front door, smiling, already rehearsing its steps. For Paul and Albert, their legacy must not be defined by how they died, but how they lived, together, in love, for more than 30 years. If you found this case as shocking and disturbing as we did, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to the Silent Casebook. Your support helps us continue to tell these stories with accuracy, detail, and respect. Because behind every headline, there are families, lives, and stories that deserve to be remembered.